third presentation in this session is by Praveen Kumar. Praveen is a professor in the Hydro Systems Group of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at the U of I, and calls himself hydrocomplexity. So I'll let him explain what that means.
All right. Thank you, John. I'm sorry to be standing between you and food in a meeting devoted to food, but we'll try to get through this in 25 minutes at a rapid pace. The picture you see on the left-hand side is when I was in India. Everybody's telling India stories, so I should tell one, right? Last year. And on the top left, that's a wheat field. In the middle, you have the mandi, as they call it, the marketplace where the farmers bring their harvest to sell, both to the government and people. And at the bottom, you have people who go and scavenge the fields after it has been harvested so that they can get food for their family. There is food security in India. India produces enough food for its population, and the problem is with distribution. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. There has been a lot of discussions related to food shortage, and most of the predictions associated with catastrophe don't bear out, partly because we as human beings tend to develop disruptive technologies which basically overcome those projections. So the projections are important in motivating us to develop those technologies. It is in that context that I'm going to present a story. It's very, very narrow as compared to the kind of things which we have seen so far in the morning, which is very inspirational, by the way. This is a research we started doing about 7 years ago. We got an NSF grant from the Carbon and Water Project, and Darren Dury, who was a postdoc with me, Venkat, who was a student doing his PhD with me, and collaborator Steve Long, who was very inspirational, Carl Banaki, they all contributed to this research. So let's step back and look at the similar pictures that everybody has shown. Basically, the world population going towards 9 billion. So that's the blue curve on the top. The purple curve on the bottom is basically arable land, and that's not growing. And as a result of that, what you have is basically land per capita, essentially. That's the black curve on that is rapidly decreasing. So between 1961 and 2009, the cultivated land grew by 12%. The rain-fed area didn't grow. The irrigated land grew 117%. So that's where a lot of the growth is happening. And that brings us to the water story. Basically, we need the water to continue to increase productivity. And given all the stories that we have heard, we may run out of water in some ways, unless you believe Manu and if you can affect the cultural change and societal change that is needed. So if you look at water use, agriculture is the largest water use globally. It varies across different parts of the world. The more developed nations and areas have more industrial use of water. That does not tell you that the water use is less, it's just the fraction that is distributed across the industrial and agriculture. So if we were to reduce water use in agriculture somehow, we could have dramatic impact on water availability. And this is another version of a map which we saw earlier, where basically the essence of the story is that the crop yield trends are plateauing, except in some areas, in some limited contexts, the yields are not increasing as they have done so. And Steve and others have already articulated this issue. So what is our primary challenge? We need to increase crop yield, but with existing land resources. We need to improve water use efficiency to conserve existing resources. And somehow we need to address the issue of global warming. And I'm going to talk about agriculture as a viable geoengineering tool to do that. And not only do we need to address this problem in the present climate, but we need to have these solutions valid 20, 30, 40, 50 years now, 100 years from now. So the guiding research question that we were trying to address is, what do plants or crops do under climate change? They acclimate. There is changes in their response. Then can we model and predict acclimation response? And I'm going to show you that we were able to do that. And once we have a model which is able to capture this acclimation response, then can we use the model to find solution to guide better breeding of crops that address our challenges, at least in some part. So can we use this model to achieve higher productivity, reduce water use, and basically affect climate change mitigation? And the particular instrument that I'm going to talk about is higher albedo. That's an ambitious agenda. So we'll talk about some of these things as we go forward. And like some of my colleagues, we take advantage of the wonderful Soy Face Facility that is available in our South farms. Steve has already talked about it. So I won't go into details. Basically, the idea is that you take a growing crop and you fumigate it with CO2 for a projected scenario and see what the plants do. And by understanding what these plants do, you can try and incorporate them in models. Right? So these plants are fumigated at 550 ppm, at least the results that we are using. And so that's associated with the projected CO2 increase under certain scenarios. In 2050, what you see is basically the plant's response is different in those scenarios. And there's a whole suite of changes. So this is from published work. There is a variety of changes that take place in these plants. So I won't go into the details in there, but the key is that these plants acclimate. They're responding to changes without an evolutionary process. And what we did in one of our publications is basically try to characterize what are these different changes that these plants are seeing. So first of all, there is a structural acclimation. Andrew would not agree with me, but we can discuss that. So basically, the leaf area index goes up under elevated CO2. There is an ecophysiological acclimation. So if you go with a thermal camera and look at it, what you'll see is that these plants are warmer. They're transpiring less water because of the enriched CO2 in the atmosphere, and the stomatal conductance goes down. And there is also some other changes associated with the assimilation of carbon in response to the CO2 concentration. So there are three types of acclimation that take place. And the net effect is that there is a fairly complex biophysical process that happens in the leaves associated with the energy balance, the boundary layer conductance, the biochemical photosynthesis, and stomatal conductance. And the net effect is what you really see as an emergent behavior of these plants. So our question was basically, can we capture this in a model? Can we characterize it from a process perspective, not an empirical perspective, so that we have predictive ability which is not anchored on the specific set of observations that we had. So we set about to do that, and there was a two-part paper published in Journal of Geophysical Research. The key is that the temperature response of these plants is very small. It's about order of sub-degree. And to capture that, we really needed a very accurate model. Most of the temperature response of existing models is within an uncertainty range of a few degrees rather than the accuracy we needed. So what we did is we sliced the vertical canopy into very thin layers. We achieved all the process interactions within that. We let the radiation penetrate through the canopy across these layers. Fairly complex models of short-wave radiation and long-wave radiation, so we get the vertical temperature profile right because these plants respond to the vertical temperature, the CO2, and everything. And we had to couple it to subsurface model. So long story short, it's a reasonably complex model, and we tested it for the Soy Face facility with a lot of the data that has been collected over the years in there. And we looked at the predictions. So I'm going to show you two predictions, one with the soybean and one with corn, basically C3 and C4 photosynthetic pathways. And what you see on the left-hand side, going from the top to bottom, is basically the carbon flux, the latent heat, the sensible heat fluxes, and comparison between observed and model. There's some flattening out in some of these things, but by and large, the predictions are very good. So that gave us confidence. These models are not calibrated at all. They are physically based. And since we are able to predict these responses, we can use them for new scenarios. So same thing with the corn model. So now that we have both pathways included in our model, we can go on to do things. And because we slice the canopy into horizontal layers, we can see the light penetration. And where does the photosynthesis take place? Through the canopy. So on the left-hand side, we have the soy canopy, and the picture there is the leaf area density. And what you see is there is a lot of leaf very close to the top there, and the light doesn't penetrate as well. On the corn, there is a more uniform penetration of light, and as a result, basically you see a lot of penetration, the photosynthesis penetrates deeper into the canopy as compared to the soybean. The latent heat flux is produced throughout the canopy. So what this told us is that because we are able to resolve the vertical structure of the plant and what is happening, maybe we can play with the structure of the plant rather than the enzymes that people have been playing with. So that's the key insight we were able to get. But before I go into that, let's look at one more piece of the story. So we compared existing scenario versus elevated CO2 scenarios. And if you look at the difference, on the left-hand side is the soybean. You can see the stimulation of the temperature. On the right-hand side is the corn on the top. So when you compare it with that gray plot versus the dotted black plot, that's the observed, the gray plot versus the model, the dotted plot. What is interesting is on the bottom, what you see is that under elevated CO2, because the foliage density is higher, the leaf area index is higher, there is a shading effect in there. So as the foliage increases, the penetration of the light through the canopy goes even down. And so the kind of productivity you would expect with a higher level of leaves, you do not get. And so I'll skip this slide. Basically, this just illustrates that it's a fairly complex process that takes place to actually produce the kind of stimulation that we were seeing. So we won't get into that. But the key insight is that the plant productivity is heterogeneously distributed through the vertical canopy structure. So it may be possible to find vertical structures that allow us to simultaneously increase productivity, reduce water use, that is transpiration, and as well as increase albedo, increase the amount of solar radiation that is reflected. And the factors that we have to play with is the total foliage, the amount of leaves, the vertical distribution of leaves, the leaf angle, and the reflectivity through the vertical profile, both for the shortwave radiation, the photosynthetically active radiation, and near infrared radiation. The balance of the two creates the temperature profile through the canopy. The picture you see is basically, this is around noon time under a soybean canopy, and you can see there is very little light penetrating through the canopy. So if you were able to increase this penetration through manipulation of these 5 variables, and if we were able to validate it for recent and future climates, maybe we have a technological solution to actually improve productivity and address all these 3 challenges. So, like everybody who's an engineer, we basically run an optimization. And what you see is what you would expect. Basically, if you decrease transpiration, which is going on the horizontal axis on the right-hand side, your carbon assimilation, the amount of carbon that the plants uptake, goes down. And if you increase albedo, same thing happens. But there is a sweet spot. There is a possibility to get solutions which are basically on the side where the carbon assimilation goes up, the albedo goes up, some amount of reflected radiation goes up, reducing the temperature, and the transpiration goes down. So, not the whole range, but there are certain structural traits which we might be able to exploit. So, as you can see in here, there are many solutions in there, and each may offer a certain advantage over the other. But the bottom line is basically we can look at the three end member solutions. Dense canopy, so basically if you want to maximize the carbon uptake, you can get a certain type of a profile, which is on the lower left bottom. If you want to minimize transpiration, you get a different profile. And if you want to maximize the amount of solar radiation that is reflected, you get a different profile. The real solution is some combination of these three. But what you start seeing is the shift in where the productivity takes place. The first one on the left-hand side shows change in carbon assimilation from the top of the canopy to further deeper in the canopy. Same thing with the transpiration, and same thing with the reflectivity. So we do have a solution space where somewhere in the combination of these that we may be able to structure the canopy in a way which achieves these goals. So the key findings is that we need to reduce the foliage, one of them. So the optimal LAI is far less than what presently the soybean canopy has. We can increase productivity by 7% with no impact on water use or albedo. We can improve water use by 13% with no impact on productivity or albedo. And we can increase albedo 34% with no impact on productivity and water use. And these results, because we have the ability to model under present and future climate, these results are robust under these things. So we have tested them for different CO2 scenarios and different temperature. I have to add a caveat. We don't have the acclimation to temperature yet in those models. That's a whole different story. However, to achieve these goals, we need to go against evolutionary trajectories. The soybean canopy has evolved over a long period of time to outcompete other neighbors and perhaps to shade the neighbors and so forth. So these solutions are non-evolutionary in this sense. But when you're using them in a domestic context, in an agricultural setting, you are providing them the competitive advantage. So basically, we may be able to exploit that to get higher productivity. So let's look at that first thing. The LAI is less than, should be less than what it is. But before we go there, when this paper came out in Global Change Biology, the people had different takes on it. So one reporter said better bred crops could send global warming out to space. And then it was reflected in the journal Cell, basically that we need to get out of the shade, or the plants need to get out of the shade, so there is a deeper penetration of photosynthesis. So the next question is, will lowering LAI really improve productivity? So my student Venkat now, who is working also with Steve Long at IGB, he set out, he was coming at the same conclusion independent of the postdoc, that lowering LAI will increase productivity. So in 2010, he went out and conducted a whole suite of field experiments in the Soy Face facility. And his thought was, well, let's artificially decrease the LAI, right? So you go there, you chop off the leaves as they are coming out, and at the end of the season, you can measure the amount of seeds And basically, what you have on the left-hand side is comparison between the ambient situation and the elevated situation, where the LAI is changed, where the thinning was applied, and so forth. The bottom line is basically on the right-hand side is under the ambient situation, which are the circular graphs, there was an increase in productivity when the LAI was reduced. And under elevated situations, that was true too at a higher level, because the plants are more productive under elevated CO2. So we're working on submitting this paper, hopefully tomorrow. So one of the things that Venkat did was to ask the question, why the heck does it happen? Why do we see that the optimal LAI is lower than where it is presently? And what he was finding was basically that the net primary productivity, which is the top graph on the left, has an increase with LAI, but then it essentially flattens out. So the graph on top is under elevated CO2, the graph on the bottom is under the present conditions. And what you have basically is, on the bottom is the potential yield. So the potential yield increases to a level and then starts to go down. Because as you add more leaves, there is maintenance costs, there is respiration costs, and so forth. So the plants are putting out far more leaves than is optimal. And as a result, the transpiration continues to increase. And so what we were trying to understand is what in the world is going on, because there is that region where we can take advantage of, right? If we decrease the leaf area index, we can improve we maintain the net primary productivity, but we increase the potential yield and reduce transpiration in there, and improve water use efficiency, which is the lower right there. So the thing is, basically, what we are beginning to characterize is that's a resilience reserve. That makes these plants resilient to vagaries of weather and variability. The question is, can we exploit this resilience reserve? And what are the risks and challenges that are associated with it? But if we are able to exploit it through breeding, then we can potentially have a significant impact on crop productivity. So the green revolution, people have talked about it today, came about because of new crop cultivars, more agricultural land, irrigation, fertilizer applications, pesticides, mechanization. At present time, most of these options are not available. You don't have water, you don't have more area, you cannot keep loading fertilizers and pesticides. And if you don't have any of that, how much more mechanization can you do? So using the new crop cultivars is possibly a mechanism to actually address this question. So Dan Ott and Steve Long recently published in Science a very, very insightful article. It's a very short article, where what you see is that dark black line, the second from the left, is actually the present yield versus precipitation. And the dotted line to the extreme right is the yields that would be supported in 2050. But to get the same yields, you will need a lot more water. So either through irrigation or precipitation, if it's going to change that much, is unlikely. And with certain amount of water use efficiency due to carbon fertilization or CO2 fertilization, you can shift that black dotted line towards that red dotted line. But the kind of breeding that we are talking about today can actually help you get to that purple extreme leftmost line, giving you far more yield at the same amount of rainfall. So that basically tells us that there is possibly a way to solve this if we look at plant breeding not just from the perspective of looking at enzymes, but looking at whole canopy structural traits in there. So the concluding thought is the nature of constraints for finding solutions to feed the next 2 billion people has changed. And the water, food, climate have become too closely linked, and the solutions require integrated interdisciplinary approaches for addressing the trade-offs. So you can't just address water issues and leave the agriculture aside or the other way around. And the in silico approach that we presented now offers the potential to significantly reduce the time for searching for viable options. Steve alluded to this in the morning, but in this case, by considering the whole plant dynamics under different climates. And think about it, with agriculture covering 15% of global ice-free terrestrial surface, appropriate solutions can have significant impact. Each year, new plants are sowed across 50% of the global land surface. And if you can change the characteristics of those, then it becomes a very viable geoengineering tool given the context of reflectivity. But we need to understand the subtleties of the nature regarding the efficiency and resilience, and that is a critical story that needs to be understood. Thank you.
Very interesting. Questions?
Hi, thank you for your talk. One of the things that you mentioned was that there would be a decreased leaf area index. Sorry. You mentioned that there would be a decreased leaf area index. However, like from an weed ecology standpoint, I would imagine that would make it less competitive against weeds. Can you speak a little bit about how that potentially would affect inputs and cultivation practices needed to deal with a different crop, and the outlook for how energy efficient that would be from a life cycle analysis point of view?
Yeah, we haven't done those analyses. I mean, that's a good point. Those are the further steps that need to be taken to see what will it take for this to be a viable technology. So I don't know if Steve wants to say something on this as to how it will compete with weeds and other things. Steve, do you have any insights? With weeds.
With weeds?
Yeah.
That is a good question, because clearly if you're changing the canopy to get more light to the bottom, obviously you're correct that weeds will, it may make weeds more competitive. But of course one of the big changes we've seen over the last 10 years is really quite a dramatic reduction, particularly with herbicide tolerant soybean and corn. So providing we can keep that herbicide tolerance up, that there may be new technologies coming in there, this strategy will work. Of course, if on the other hand we can't do that, then the strategy may be limited.
Thank you.
Hi,
Thanks, Steve.
this is Pedro. Okay. This brings me back to when I was a graduate student in the Philippines, when the plant physiologists at the Rice Institute, then here at Tanaka, Yoshida, and other ones, were just changing the structure of the rice plant from one that had a lot of leaf area index, mutual shading, which caused lodging and all sorts of things, to the erect leaves that had created the Green Revolution in other just change leaf area index, light penetration, and everything else. The only thing we weren't talking about then was albedo. Now, my point is, you may have, and it's a question, you may have an opportunity. Everybody's saying, can you backtrack these models back to real stuff? You may have an opportunity to look at the old rice literature and see if some of your ideas have been already, calibrated or whatever by
Yeah, so what,
data.
no, that's a very good point. And one of the consequences of this is that there is a theme in Steve's Gates Foundation where they are looking at exactly this kind, using these results to look at this, and they are actually growing rice plants in their bottom up to just look at the light penetration structure and so forth. So that's under works in there.
Very similar to Pedro. Actually, in fruit trees, yield double, even more, with pruning. Shorter trees that are pruned to allow more lights. And it's the same thing. You go against the evolutionary trajectory in order to increase productivity. So that suggests two things. First, the genetic solution is a good solution. Secondly, with you may find some mechanical solutions that would allow you to prune, let's say, new plants of soybean. So you can have the same thing and in a different way. But obviously, more light and more exposure can increase productivity like it does in rice and in fruit. In fruit trees, the yield effect is immense.
Yeah. Now, what we have done is basically shown the feasibility of this solution, whether it's viable. I mean, that is a lot more research to be done, from a whole different perspective. So I'm not arguing against more of those studies.
Please join me in thanking our speakers from this last session, and we'll have instruction on lunch from the experts.
Thank you.
Illinois.